Hi there, Nick Askew from Conservation Careers here, and welcome to the podcast. Now, in conservation, some issues tend to get a lot of attention from donors and the public, when other equally important issues can be ignored. Now, what do you do in this situation to raise the profile and the much needed funding in order to conserve the overlooked species, sites and ecosystems? Now, to discuss this and more, we're speaking with Nina Seale from Synchronicity Earth. Now, Synchronicity Earth aims to be a different kind of conservation organisation. They are research driven and they raise the profile and distribute donor funding to the conservation sector, often towards the less sexy areas of work. Now, as communication manager, Nina's role is to tell the stories of the conservation organisation and individuals supported by Synchronicity Earth. A talented writer, we talk about her day-to-day work in comms, along with her career path and advice for people like you who might be interested to follow in her footsteps. We also discuss the importance of addressing the diversity deficit in conservation and the actions she's taken to found an equity, diversity and inclusion working group at Synchronicity Earth. Now, the chat was recorded in front of a live audience of Conservation Careers Academy members who got to ask their questions of Nina after the recording had finished. Now, if you'd like to be in the audience yourself of our podcast recordings, along with enjoying access to the world's biggest conservation job board and our private members community of over 1,000 aspiring and professional conservationists, please check out the Conservation Careers Academy, which is www.conservationcareers.com/academy. Okay, let's get into this wide-ranging and career-boosting discussion with Nina. Enjoy.
Hi Nick, I'm Nina Seale. I am Communications Manager for Synchronicity Earth.
Great. Well, welcome, Nina. It's good to have you on the podcast. Thanks for kind of carving out the time to chat. So you're comms manager at Synchronicity Earth. And I always like to kind of start these conversations like with the organizations and, what that's all about, assuming that the listeners, know nothing about Synchronicity Earth. Who or what is it? Can you just paint a little bit of a picture, like describe the organization and what you do?
For sure. A lot of people haven't heard of Synchronicity Earth. That's part of, I guess, the strategy that we've carved out is that we are doing an awful lot behind the scenes, but we're not necessarily pushing forward our brand. So I will tell you about what we do because I'm very passionate about it. We specialize in overlooked and underfunded species and ecosystems. And we particularly focus on community-led organizations. We're overlapping more and more into Indigenous people's rights and biocultural diversity and how that interacts with biological diversity. And so we have 6 programs that specialize on these different topics that have been carved out with lots of research. So we have an amphibian program, we have an Asian species program, we have freshwater, Congo Basin, Asian species. Did I do that one already?
Not sure. Maybe. Yeah. I've got ocean as well.
Ocean and biocultural diversity. I think I repeated Asian species twice. Yeah. So, some of those are regional focuses, some of those are species focuses. The most recent program, Biocultural Diversity, as I say, is more following the ever-increasing exciting organizations and people that we're finding that are working between the crossover between cultural diversity and biological diversity, which is really fascinating and not something that I've done before. So yeah, that's our organization. As I say, that we fund these incredible organizations. A lot of them are grassroots and community run, but also especially say on the ocean side and the policy side, it's all about for us trying to fund things that are really difficult to fund, which makes my job really interesting. And I'm sure we're talking about that. But like policy work, which is not as exciting and easy to communicate, but is absolutely so valuable, and even small amounts of money can go such a long way when you're talking about funding one person who's going to be the right person who needs to be in the right room at the right time. So yeah, that's what we do.
Super cool organization. Yeah. So you're a funder then, like you provide funding and support to, I've read, like 180 or more different conservation partners and charities around the globe, according to those kind of 6 programs of work that you're working on. And let's start from the funding. Like, where does the funding come from? How do you allocate grants? How do you choose? Do you have proposals? Just talk through like the funding process, if you wouldn't mind, just to kind of get that.
Sure. And especially if you're early on in conservation and you don't understand it too well, there's quite
Yeah.
for us to have these sort of fundraising machine type organizations that are based in countries and the sort of industries that might be looking to give a lot of money towards biological conservation or any other cause, basically. And we are the right channels for that. So a lot of our work will be, as you say, finding where that money should go and developing relationships with organizations on the ground. And we at Synchronicity Earth are actually very, very relationship based. So you're talking there about proposals and many organizations. And I'm actually also a trustee of Bug Life, which is difference between, we're talking here Synchronicity Earth being a funder organization. Bug Life is an organization based in the UK that does the conservation work directly in the UK.
So they're a recipient, I guess, is what, yeah.
Exactly. Synchronicity Earth tends to fund organizations mainly overseas. And so we are essentially a funding organization, as you said. I've forgotten your question. What was
Yeah,
it?
where does the money come from then? How are you raising the money? Like, is it your own money? Are you raising it from others? I'm interested in that piece.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both actually. So my organization was founded by Adam and Jessica Sweden, and they have a foundation called the Synchronicity Foundation. And initially, I think when they were starting to get into philanthropy, and both of them are very passionate about the underdog and really wanting to do the most exciting work, which is the work that nobody else is doing. So the stuff that's hard to fund, as I say, the stuff that it is much harder to communicate to lots and lots of people. And so they started doing this work, and they were pulled in lots of different directions, not just environment, but it was, I think they both had a bit of a moment where they realized that something that was intersecting with all these different things that they were interested in was the environmental crisis. And that was when they decided to really focus in on it. And that was when they founded Synchronicity Earth 14 years ago. And since then, they then started doing research, developing the programs. And then, they're very much based in the philanthropy sector. And Adam Sweden is, I'm not going to say his job title because I don't want to get it wrong, but he works for a hedge fund called Aurum. And so he's very much based in the financial sector. Jessica works a lot in sort of arts and culture spaces, as well as the philanthropy space. And so between them, they have so many people that they know who ask them about what they're doing. And I think that was, again, another reason why they wanted to set up Synchronicity Earth, so that there was a channel for other funders who wanted to fund Synchronicity Earth that would then go out to all the amazing projects that we were finding. And so those are the two main channels at the moment between foundations. Do you want me to explain what foundations are?
You can if you wish. Why not?
Might get it wrong. So you have individuals who are engaging in philanthropy. So that might be somebody who has a lot of wealth that they would like to give to various charities. And then sometimes when that gets like a little bit too complicated for just one person to be doing on their own, they set up a foundation, which tends to be based on, say, one person or one family's wealth that then gives from there. And as I say, we have a foundation kind of behind us called the Synchronicity Foundation. And we are a bit of a cross between a foundation and a charity because of our relationship to the Synchronicity Foundation. Sorry, this is getting very complicated. And so other foundations basically give to Synchronicity Earth, and that's a key source of our funding. And then we are, with this sort of background in the finance sector through other hedge funds and things like that, that's an area that we've been growing. But I think, part of it is that we're always looking for new opportunities as well. I think it's just the main thing, especially going back to what I said at the beginning, which is probably that you haven't heard of Synchronicity Earth and you haven't heard of us because our fundraising doesn't depend on public facing fundraising the way a lot of other organizations that say have a strategy of building a membership, again, like Bug Life, or taking on small donations from like 1,000 people rather than one big donation from one person, that's the strategy that we've gone with. So our brand recognition isn't as important to us because it's not a key part of our fundraising strategy in the same way, but something we are very passionate about. And that's where the comms come in and my role comes in, is that we really want to try and make these overlooked species and ecosystems and approaches more well known. Like, it doesn't need to be that it comes from Synchronicity Earth. We don't need to have our logo everywhere, but we absolutely want more people to care about amphibians. We want more people to know that Southeast Asia is a massive biodiversity hotspot, and yet so many of those species that are unique to that region are critically endangered and are in desperate need of action. And also talk about the amazing work that our partners are doing. Like, again, something that will probably come up a bit later in the interview is
well, it's the perfect segue. I was actually going to ask, do you have any particular projects or programs, or I don't want to say favorites, that's not fair on you, but give us a few examples of some of the work and projects that you're funding that you'd like to share.
My colleague's going to laugh because we talk about favorites sometimes, and one of my colleagues definitely has a huge thing for the ocean program, and I think partly because he does, it means that I can't also choose ocean all the time. And so I'm gonna go with, say, people rather than programs or anything. But there's one of the absolute highlights of my career. It was a couple of years ago when I interviewed somebody called Caleb Ofori Boateng, who was the first formally trained Ghanaian herpetologist, and he.
And herps are like frogs and toads and lizards and all that. Have I got that right?
Yes, so right. Amphibians and reptiles.
Yep.
And Ghana has an incredible forest called the Atiwa Forest, which for, I don't know, maybe as long as Synchronicity Earth has been around at least, has been under threat of bauxite mining, which is a sort of core mineral that's used for aluminium. And he I think his dad was a ranger in a local park, and I think that was what really brought him into starting to understand nature and forests, and that being important because he was inseparable from his dad. He was always following him around. He lost his dad at an early age, and it wasn't until later that he actually went into one of Ghana's amazing forests, and it was the Atiwa Forest. When he was just sort of volunteering as an assistant. And that was when I think he really just completely fell in love with it. It was already in his blood, and he already has this huge dedication of his career to his father in that loss. But he really fell in love with frogs, and to hear him talking about it as well, and the kind of work that he's done. And that interview is online and does far better justice to Caleb than I can do myself here. But talking to him was so unbelievably inspiring, and I've been very lucky. I've managed to interview some really incredible conservationists who are very well known and had such interesting conversations. But I cried twice in that interview. We were on Zoom and the cameras were off. It was in COVID times, so I was kind of keeping it to myself. And then when I was editing the interview, I cried again. He talks about that he discovered a new species of frog and he named it after his mother. And when he spoke about that, it made me so emotional because he really knows how much his family has been behind his. When I say success, he brings everyone with him on his success. Caleb is very much somebody at the heart of the communities he works with. So it's not like one individual alone on his own, pioneering. He's bringing everyone with him. He sees the potential for these communities who live alongside Atiwa to fight for that forest and how important it is for them. And so that was my favorite interview that I've ever done. And I have a massive soft spot for his organization, which is Herp Conservation Ghana. So there's one example. Let me think of another example that I can give you. I need to not choose another frog. Okay, so this maybe links in with my work a little bit more and the journey that I've had in my career. But I'm going to talk about an organization called Hutan in Malaysian Borneo. You're nodding. Have you heard of them?
No, I've heard of them a bit, but I'd love to hear about your connection to them. Yeah.
Sure. So I used to work at an organization called Wildland Trust, and something that was really nice when I moved to Synchronicity Earth was that they had some partners in common. So it meant that organizations I'd already spent years writing about, people that I knew were still, and projects I was incredibly excited about were still going to be people that I worked with and organizations I could continue to follow and hear about and talk about. And that's been really lovely. And one of those organizations was Hutan. And when I was working at Wildland Trust, we worked on a campaign to try and stop a local politician who had a campaign to build this sort of highway across the Kinabatangan River, really neighboring a village called Sakau. And his campaign had really polarized the local population, people who wanted this bridge, people who didn't want this bridge. And I think there was a lot of misinformation around that campaign. And but the price that, well, the local communities would pay, but also the local biodiversity, which in Borneo, and these, like in Borneo, there's so much oil palm plantations everywhere, and I'm not really going to trash them because there's more to that story than is often spoken about. But in terms of the forest as it was, well, the closest imitation of what it was originally, this rich rainforest where there's so many habitats and so much unique species, and that's where the orangutans are and the elephants are, is basically strips hugging that river. And they're already divided by the river. And if you study conservation, then you know connections, and making connections is so important when you're talking about habitat. And so another division would have been caused by that highway, which, due to the pollution and noise control, and also just the process of constructing it, would have again bisected those two, when I talk about either sides of the river, have really important habitats. So this campaign was huge for Bhutan, but also like Bhutan staff are mostly all local people. And so they were in the middle of this really difficult political situation. And in the end, the bridge was cancelled. I don't think the road was cancelled, and that was a huge win for them. And I remember at the time when I was working on it that I really wanted to go to Borneo. I was writing about it all the time, and I was very passionate about it. And but I decided that if this bridge went ahead, this highway went ahead, I wouldn't go. I would never go to see it. But if it did, then I would have to organize a trip, and it did. So I had to organize a trip, and I went and I visited. And I mean, I don't necessarily think roles like mine should have lots of travel to project countries funded by the organization. I think we're funding the organizations and the local people for a reason. They are the ones who should be doing the work. So my organization didn't actually fund me. I paid for a holiday to go there. But like, because I knew all these contacts, I ended up staying in a local homestay in Sakau that was run by somebody who worked for Bhutan. So it was very interlinked, and I ended up visiting all these project sites. And they showed me so many aspects of their work, and they do so many different interesting things. Like, they have this nest box program for critically endangered hornbills. They have an all-female reforestation team that I could talk about for so long. They were fascinating, and they were wonderful women, and watching them work together was amazing. I was very lucky. I got to see wild elephants. I got to see wild orangutans with the research team that they have that's been following these orangutans for generations. Like, they're doing so many interesting things. And you know, if you ever visit a project, it's always going to have a special place in your heart. And then when I moved to Synchronicity Earth, this is a partner that we still had, and we actually specifically funded the reforestation team as part of a program I didn't quite mention earlier. It's called Northern Carbon. It's usually because we don't communicate about it so much. It's not growing in the same rate that everything else is, but we've had this relationship with Bhutan for a really long time. And their focus on empowering women in the community is so important to Bhutan, but it's actually a theme that runs through so many of the organizations that we fund. Is empowering women in leadership, is women-led organizations. One of our goals, I think, is to have 60 or 70% of the organizations that we work with to have women in leadership positions. And I think we're already significantly on the way there, but you know, that sort of thing is so important to us. And so to be able to continue to follow them and hear their stories and write about them has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, and you're clearly passionate about it. And I used to work in comms myself. We have a similar trajectory, I think, when I look back at your career as well. And I found that, and I agree also that you don't need to do many trips, you know, particularly when you're working in comms. You can do so much remotely, and even more remotely nowadays. Zoom and everything works really well. But if you do get to visit a project site, you do get to see something, then the connection stays with you for years, you know, and the passion you can kind of put into your communications is so much greater, you know, so they are really valuable things to do if you can actually go and see and feel and touch and understand at a much deeper level, having kind of gone to the sites. So your comms manager, I want to try and move things along to kind of your role if I can. And obviously we're talking about comms quite a lot here already, but so you're comms manager at Synchronicity Earth. We've got a bit of a view as to, like, you know, what the organization, what it does, how you work. But what's your role? I mean, how would you describe your job to someone who doesn't understand who you are? How do you describe it to your grandparents or your auntie or uncle? Someone who's outside the industry. Like, what do you do as a comms manager?
I do tend to tell people that I'm a writer.
Right.
A writer for a wildlife charity. If people ask me, what do you do? I'm a writer for a wildlife charity. That seems to sum it up, and most people will understand that. And also at the core of my skill set, I am a writer. That is what I am best at. It's what I've always been best at. And it just happens that I love writing about wildlife and I love writing about conservation. So that for me is the way I describe it at the simplest level. At the more complex level of now being a comms manager, I spent a long time as a comms assistant and a comms officer. I'm now a manager. There are various different ways that we are communicating. And when I talk about communicating, another simple way to think about it is storytelling. So we are telling the stories of our partners. We are trying to inspire people, help them understand the threats that are happening in a way that is not just road development, to use the example I was talking about before. Like what I did before, I was telling you about exactly what that road meant to the local people and telling the story fully. Just sort of having facts is quite dry, but telling the actual stories behind it is so much more powerful. And that's at the heart of my job. And that's what I've spent the last 10 years getting better at. And so we have various different ways that we reach people and communicate with people. So one simple way is the website. And you have static information on a website. So say a page that would be talking about Bhutan and the work that they do, and it needs to last for a few years, that stays there, or a blog, which might be an individual story. So the example is Sakau's Bridge, or the bridge that didn't happen. So we'll call it just that's that campaign. That would be a story, that would be a blog or a temporary content. So then what could we do with that website information? Well, we'll share it on social media. We'll turn it into different types of information for social medias. We might have a series of videos, we might have a series of beautiful images, parceling out that story into focusing in on one person and what their home and what Sakau means to them might be an example. And at Synchronicity Earth, we use 4 social media channels regularly. That's Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. So I really don't like Facebook. That's why I always leave it last. And so things like this, a podcast would count as communications. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
And videos themselves, I spoke about using videos for social media, but there's lots of other ways you can use them. You can use them in events. You can use them as the center of an event. We had our last anniversary event on our 10th anniversary. We had a beautiful film that was released, and we watched it in a cinema in a beautiful venue and invited lots of people who we wanted to share our journey with us. We also have written materials. So we have an annual review, we call it Spotlight, and that looks back on everything we did in last year. And it's full of stories. It has the kind of information that, say, a donor might be really interested in terms of how much money is coming in and where is it going. But it also tells the story of people like Caleb, of the kind of the frogs that he works on. It brings out those stories and shows the impact in terms of this is what it means to specific people that you've funded us, for example. So working on sort of actual materials that you can hold in your hands is a big part of our jobs as well. That's comms.
And why is comms important in conservation?
I recently, there was somebody in my team called Jessie who wrote a blog about her experience as communications intern. It is on Conservation Careers website if you want to read it. And she summed it up really well. And it's partly because it's obviously what she thinks is important, but also I was training her for all this time, so I feel like I can take credit for it as well. But she was like, if people don't know about what you're doing, then they're not going to care. And communications is, I think, the most important job in the building, because you can be doing the most fantastic, wonderful things, but if you're not able to tell people and inspire them, then you're not going to get support for that. You're not going to get people who understand that action can happen. We have so much doomism in the environmental movement of people thinking that nothing can be done and that nothing's happening, because they're not hearing those stories enough. And it's hard to break through the so much information all the time in this digital age, but like if we try and break through with those stories, when we do, it's so important to show people that not only is action possible, but it is happening all the time. And I don't think people have the imagination to know just how incredible some of these people are who are working for these organizations, people like Caleb. But Caleb is just one person who I happen to meet. There are so many other people with extraordinary stories.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people on the podcast and in other ways, and communications often comes out as one of the most important areas that we need to be better at in conservation, and where the opportunities are greatest for having the most impact. In the sense that we're quite good at kind of preaching to the converted, we're preaching to talking to people who already understand and care about our movement. What we need to be better at is reaching out to wider audiences, new people, engaging people who are outside of our interest group, and bringing them in and building more support. And that's where the opportunity lies. So I couldn't agree more. Like, the work that you and others do in comms is just so vital. And it's needed. We're going to keep ramping it up more and more. As a kind of comms manager, we talked about just before the chat, we're here to kind of share transparency really in terms of what a job is like within conservation. What is it you'd like to share in terms of what you enjoy about the job, and any perhaps challenges or things you don't enjoy about your role? Like, what would you share the kind of highs and lows?
What do I enjoy about my job? I think, it's probably come across in this interview already, when I'm actually getting to work on the stories and looking at something and thinking, how can I make this interesting? I spoke about the Synchronicity Earth. We specialize in overlooked things. We specialize in things that are difficult to communicate. It's very different from my old job, because World Land Trust is habitat based, and that's quite a simple message. You say habitat to save wildlife. And so the type of support there was reasonably easy to communicate. In some ways was, the reward was so much faster there. But here we have to develop a longer relationship with our audiences to make them understand more complicated situations, because that's what we specialize in, hard to communicate things. And so looking at something and thinking, how can I make this pop off the page is really where I get very interested in things. And we have something coming out soon called the Second Global Amphibian Assessment, which is where the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, their red list, which monitors the conservation status of species all around the world, they have reviewed so much information, a huge amount of information about more than 8,000 amphibian species, to update them, because obviously you can't just review a status of a species and then say, cool, that's done, it's least concern, we don't need to worry about its conservation status. It changes all the time, so you have to do these updates. And we've got this huge update coming up, and it has a wealth of information about the status of amphibians worldwide, but it's all numbers. It's all numbers and species names, and the species names are often in Latin. So even Priya, who's our amphibian program manager, she doesn't know what all those species are. Who would? And so, thinking about how we're going, when that update finally gets published, and that will happen soon, look out for it. It's like, how can we make that information interesting to people? Because something that I hate, and it happens all the time, is that we get these headlines and it's like, scientists say that the climate is worse than ever. And I'm kind of simplifying, but I'm also kind of not. The number of times I've read that headline, and I hate it so much, because nobody's clicking on that anymore. We've known that for the last 20 years. You've read that headline for the last 20 years. But a difference here would be, there are 4 species that have been confirmed extinct in that update. And when I say confirmed extinct, that is, they are really, really certain that those species do not exist anymore. Like, they've looked, there's been more than one search and they haven't been found. And that's really tragic. It's a huge loss. There's actually, that number could be as high as 223. It could be higher than that. We don't have all the historical information ever about amphibians. I'm trying to remember if that 223 figure, if that's referring to the number total before this update or not. It might actually be. Anyway, I don't have the information in front of me. But that basically the number is confirmed for, but it could be much, much greater, because we don't have all the historical information about amphibians, and these are only the 4 species that have had really thorough searches for. So the number is likely to be much higher, but these 4 are the ones we're certain about. And in the campaign that I'm working on at the moment, I researched these 4 species. What did we know about them? What did they look like? What were the stories around them? And I'm not going to spoil it because it's going to come out soon and maybe you'll read it, but figuring out this is the way that at least I will engage in just how important all this information is. It's the reality is that if we continue as we are, we're going to lose species one by one, species that are as important and special and interesting as each one of these four. And I think that's a way to emotionally engage people in this huge number of 8,000 species, and a great number of them being under threat of extinction, is to be like, let's focus in on the one, or in this case, the four. Okay, and I'm going to tell you about these four species and why you should feel that loss, that no one will ever see one of those again.
Yeah. And I guess extending that, connecting that to some action that someone can take to help, support, do something. Yeah, absolutely. Once you kind of got that attention. Fascinating work. Yeah. Before we kind of move on to your kind of career path and how you got to where you are, I also noticed in your profile that you founded and co-run the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Working Group at Synchronicity Earth. And that's something we talked just before the recording too. That's something that's really you're passionate about. EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. What is this working group? Why did you set it up? Why is it important?
Thank you for asking. I am so passionate about it. And I think this kind of reflects just how your career can move in directions that you do not anticipate. Yeah. I used to think I wanted to work in the program's research side. I remember my first time when I was introduced to an organization, I was told that was where the magic happened. As I've already said, it's not, it's in comms. But it took me a long time to realize that I was exactly where I wanted to be. Yeah. But something that has come up while I've been working at Synchronicity Earth, partly because of the culture here, which is very much, it's trust-based, like everything else in our organization. The way we interact with partners is trust-based. It's the same with their staff. Mm-hmm. And I came to this organization with a really hellish job search. I'd been searching for a job for about 9 months. I'd applied for more than 50 roles. I'd had about 10 interviews, and when I tell you that none of them went badly, like I didn't interview badly, I was just never the number one. And it's something that anyone who's wanted to work in conservation is familiar with. It is not an easy sector to get into. And you can have so much unpaid work experience to get your first foot in the door. In order to have that first conversation, you don't have a shot. And I say that with all the privilege that I have as a middle-class white woman who went to a private school. And that it was tough for me with all the privilege that I carry and I hold. We have a big diversity and inclusion issue in the environment sector, and that is one of the places that it starts, is that in order to get the first paid experience, and for many, many people, paid experience is the only experience it's the only experience they can do, because they can't afford literally to do unpaid work experience. And to have a system that relies on that is really bad. And, even my first few jobs, I just saw that there wasn't paid work experience opportunities around me for young people to really start to understand what this sector is about. And so, I came to Synchronicity Earth, and we had one work experience placement that's associated with one school. They would come in for like a week in summer. And that was where it started for me. I was like, that's not enough. That's not enough. We need to be serving the community that serves us, which is the talent pool that we are then hiring from. And we need to do it as well as we can. And it took a long time, I think, to sort of like, of me being like, this is important, can we do it? And I'm working in the comms team, I'm not working in HR. So and eventually, there were a couple of other people, and they each had their own perspective on inclusion and the things that they wanted to be important. It might have been events based, or it might have been around disability rights. We kind of started having these regular meetings. We started implementing these little things, developing relationships with organizations that could help build us work experience, for example, or making a list of things that we need to absolutely make sure we consider for events, especially, say, an example here being around disability and access. And it started just being this thing where we were bringing these different experiences that we had to the table. And my manager, who's head of communications, ended up being like, why don't we build a structure around this, and we'll call it a working group. And that way we'll make a process so that you're able to apply for things to the board, that you're able to present to the senior leadership team, so that you actually have power to take these things forward. And it's also considered as part of your job role. Because up until that point, he'd kind of just been letting me do it in addition to my other work, but like we hadn't really factored it in. And so from there, when we officially had a system, I think there was a point I gave a little presentation on the various work that we were doing to the staff, and suddenly it went from like 3 people to 9 people who were a part of this, because everyone cares about, once they understand what EDI is, and it is that trying to make our working environment better for everyone, inclusive for everyone, and the various experiences that you're bringing. And for people who aren't in the organization yet, as I say, we have a diversity issue in the environment sector. So there are a whole bunch of people we're not able to reach yet, that as part of that. And yeah, I think, also to put this in perspective in the timeline, July 2020 happened in the middle of this as well. And I think that was a huge wake-up call for, obviously people all over the world, but in the environment sector, where we have particularly low ethnic diversity, I think finally we were galvanized to action. So it went from me wondering, like, who can we work with? Who is doing this kind of work? Where can you get this information? To suddenly things were popping out the walls. And we were like, okay, so we could fund this project. So there was something called Race for Nature's Recovery, which was was using the government's Kickstart scheme, which was funding 6-month work experience placements for 18 to 25-year-olds who were on universal credit. It is now over, sadly, but it was using that scheme, leveraging them to get young people into the environment sector, into those placements. And I think they placed over 100 young people in those placements. And so as a funder, having persuaded and like our organization that it was important, we gave a small grant towards it. It wasn't a big grant. It's not a huge part of what we do, but we managed to wangle a small grant that we could give to the partners that were running it. And then we also hosted somebody as well. That was somebody who was then in my team, who I was managing. And that's just one example of the type of work that we've been doing. Eventually became so big, as there was a lot of people who were interested in a lot of work that we were doing, that I ended up wanting to step down, and it ended up being that 2 people offered to help co-run it, and then we discussed it. It was like, actually the 3 of us could run this together, and so that's what we're doing. And we've been working on really incredible EDI strategy, where every single team has looked at their practices and thought of how could we make this the best it could possibly be. Like what my vision is, that we will have the type of EDI strategy that other organizations will be able to look to and be like, this is what is possible. Because I think at the moment, when we looked at other EDI strategies, we could only really find them in universities. We couldn't find public ones for other organizations like us. And so what I would really love is that one day we'll be able to have something that we're really proud of, that is really strong, that's consulted with all the types of people who would be able to feed into what could be missing. So employees like me who are like, this is important, but maybe not at senior management level, can be like, but this organization is doing it. Why can't we? Like, these are the types of things that we could be doing. Why aren't we doing them? Because influencing the wider sector is what I want after that, because it's not just about me and Synchronicity Earth and my team. Obviously, I want us to have a super inclusive work culture, but it's about the wider environmental sector.
Amazing. Yeah, well done you for spearheading that and for kind of gaining the traction you're already seeing. And I love the vision of actually using it almost like a template that others can learn from and spread it out, from within the movement. So super important work. Yeah, well done you. I'm conscious of time. We've got a couple of people listening in as well who want to ask questions at the end. So I'm going to make sure we kind of save a bit of space for them too. Before we kind of move over to kind of final questions, I'm going to put a double question together for you and try and keep it in a fairly tight nutshell. What have been the kind of main career steps you've taken to date when you look back that have been really important to you to get you to where you are? And off the back of that, what lessons have you learned in terms of advice that other people might be able to kind of learn from as well, other aspiring either conservationists or perhaps communicators, people in your area of work? So career steps and advice, I'm kind of bundling it into one just for sake of time.
Sure. So career steps and advice. I think the biggest thing for my career that I did early on was that I went off to university. I struggled to what I was going to choose. I was like, will I study English, which is what I'm actually good at, or study biology, zoology, which is what I'm passionate about? And I chose zoology because I knew that I've been writing since I could hold a pen. Like, I knew I wasn't ever going to stop writing, but I was worried that I wouldn't be able to focus in on these topics if I didn't study them. But I also was really rubbish at it. I was not a great researcher. My dissertation was not great. But what I did while I was at university, and this was a big factor in choosing my universities, was I was part of the student newspaper. And first week, I eyeballed the student newspaper. I started writing for every single section. It was I was spending far more time on the paper than my studies for a while. I ended up becoming editor of the new science and environment section. I then, because we were on a different campus, I was then running a team of writers from a different campus, which was a whole different thing. And then I became chief editor as well in my time there. And the amount of learning that I did then, that was when I first learned how to use Adobe InDesign, which I am giving a training for here in a couple of weeks. Like there were so many things, learning how to write quickly, learning how to edit, figuring out how to condense stories into something digestible, how to write news properly. There were so many different things I learned from that experience. And that's not even mentioning the management and project management stuff I did as an editor. So that was huge for me. And so the message behind that, the advice is to focus, to understand what it is that you can bring, what you're good at. And it may be that you are really passionate about frogs. I am passionate about frogs, obviously. You're really passionate about frogs, but you're not actually that good at research. And that doesn't need to mean that you can't do anything for it or about it. Like it may be that, like me, writing is what you do, writing is what you're good at, and that's what you can bring. And as I say, like initially at the start of my career, the messaging in that organization that I first did work experience in was kind of like, if you're not in that room where you're working directly with the partners, then your job is just not as important. And it took so long for me to be like, no, the fact that I am bringing exactly what I can do, and I can do better than the people in the other teams who are working on their specific skills, is exactly where I need to be. There's somebody in my organization called Victoria. I had a long discussion about databases this morning, which was frying my brain. But databases are so interesting for Victoria. She's so good at it. And she also studied zoology, started an internship here like 10 years ago or something, was on every single team. And it turns out that systems and operations is where her brain, just like problem solving, is exactly what she's good at. And there are so many colleagues like that at Synchronicity Earth. And I'm like, I'm so glad you're good at that one thing I'm terrible at, so I don't have to do it. I don't have to think about it. So I think figuring out what you're good at and letting yourself do that as well. And so, student newspaper, that wasn't following the environmental thing. It was just me getting better at writing. Yeah. And you doing that, focusing in on your skills. Maybe it's website design, maybe it's photography. There are so many different things that you could be working on and that will build the skills that will make you invaluable to this sector. And that's my advice, is to focus on what you're good at, and hold that those skills will be important, even if you're not being David Attenborough or Steve Backshall. You're not going to necessarily be working in the field all the time. It's focus on what you're good at. And for me, like, my job is about supporting the people on the ground and what they're doing and telling their stories. And so I think sometimes when people talk about dreams of working in wildlife, you do have examples like David Attenborough and Jane Goodall, these one individuals that are brought up. And when I spoke about Caleb, obviously I was talking about one person. It's easier to connect to a story about one person. But what was so important to me about telling his story was just how much of a community he represents, so many different people that he brings and uplifts with him. He's mentoring a herpetologist in Cameroon right now called Marina, who is also similar to him, just like going to be one of the first people to really stand up for amphibian conservation in Cameroon. There isn't an organization there currently that's doing it, except for the one that she's just founded. He's mentoring her. So, like, this is a community effort. It's not about the individual, and understanding that the skills that you bring to the team community effort of conservation is what to focus on.
I love that. Yeah. And what I'm hearing is understand what you're really good at and work on it, refine it. You became a hack, on the student paper, became really good at that. And then layer that on top of what you love and what you're passionate about. And for you, it's frogs and conservation, telling people stories and finding that sweet spots of bringing those two things together, passion and skills. Yeah, brilliant. Well, we're almost up on time. I do want to ask perhaps one or two just kind of wider questions as we kind of wrap up. Quick and dirty one would be, if you could choose to see one species at one site, where would you go and what would you look at?
I've spoken so much about amphibians in this podcast. It seems like I'm obsessed.
You've got a frog behind you on the wall, I noticed too. So
I know. And like I said at the beginning, like, we don't have favorites and everyone's going to think it's really obvious. Um, ah, okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about fish. So, so I have a frog here, and it's called the Copen Brook frog. So I'm just going to put it out there. Google it. It's beautiful. It's the prettiest frog. It's in Guatemala, I think, or Honduras. But I'm going to tell you about freshwater fish because that's one of the areas that we specialize in as well. We have a sister organization called Shoal. They have a campaign called the Search for Lost Fishes. So in that campaign, there are 10 species that they really want to find. And it's everything that about a comms campaign that I adore. Like, you know, you've got these 10 species, so you know what you're focusing on. When the campaign was originally thought of, Michael, the person behind the campaign, Michael Emerson, I'll just shout him out because he's great at his job. He chose species that hadn't been seen for like 10 years or more that could still be out there. So unlike those 4 species that I mentioned, the searches haven't really happened. They could be extinct, but they could still be out there, and they're likely to still be out there, but nobody's seen them. The campaign tells the stories. Like, he picked 10 out of a really long list that he thought interesting for different reasons. Maybe they were like incredible looking. You know, there are a couple that are just really pretty, but some of them have only ever been seen. I think the one that I'm about to mention, and the campaign started a couple of years ago, so I'm a little bit rusty, but it's called the Haditha cave fish, and I think was only ever seen in a cave underneath a temple. So if you think about the Indiana Jones-like quest,
it
would be required to find this fish, you know, and the excitement of actually seeing it, of actually finding it, is absolutely phenomenal. So that's one example. The one that they are actively searching for at the moment, that Shoal is actually funding an expeditions to go and find, is called the fat catfish, which is a great name. Again, like, what a good species to pick. And the fat catfish, it looks a bit like the Michelin Man. It's almost like the way the fat is around the body is almost like brains. It's in these big veins, and as I said, just haven't been seen for a really long time. So I really hope somebody finds it, maybe not me. But those types of stories, we had somebody in the office last week who was talking about rediscovered species or newly discovered species, and somebody finding them in rice paddy fields, and they only come out between 2 and 6 in the morning. So like, that's why they'd never been seen, because they just come out at the time when there's no humans around and nobody's looking in rice paddies for tiny little fish. And think about how many other little fish there are like that, and how important they could be. These are really pretty fish, by the way. So yeah, I would pick one of the lost species, I think, because I want somebody who's actually on one of those expeditions who's really passionate about it to find the fat catfish. And I don't know too much about the team behind the Haditha cavefish. If there is one, I'm going to pick that one because I don't want to take away any credit from the fat catfish people. But like, to find a species that hasn't been seen in so long, that would be amazing.
Love it. I love the fat catfish. You could imagine like some sort of donor kind of campaign, trying to find some fat cats to fund it, maybe, you know, something like that. Yeah.
I'll ask Michael if he's used that yet. I'm not sure we about donors and fat cats.
We need some fat cats to find these. Yeah. And I guess the other thing, in terms of like, you know, extinctions as well, you talked about those 4 frogs that are definitely gone, and there's 10 fish here that may or may not be gone. We're not sure. It's always easy to kind of. So I'm a birder. I'm also a fisherman. I got a picture of me fishing right now, next to me right now.
Nice.
And when you see like the first swallow of the year kind of returning on migration, you know the first one's always easy to kind of to identify, but you never know when the last one is. You know, you watch the swallows go. They might see another one, might see another one, and extinction's the same. You know, the last sighting doesn't mean it's the last one you'll ever see, and it's very hard to kind of determine that that's it. It's gone. There's definitely no more out there. So it's really sad when it's finally kind of declared, you know, and that's it. You know, we've looked, it's not there. But there's still that little bit of hope, I think, with those 10 species, isn't there? And that's a kind of nice point, I think, to kind of wrap the podcast up on that element of hope, that we can still look and they might still be there and we can still save them. So cool. I shall look for the fat catfish after the podcast and look for a picture of it.
Yeah, especially if you're into fishing, then you're obviously very passionate about freshwater fish. I really love the work that Shoal does, and Shoal, unlike Synchronicity Earth, I think does take direct donations. You can sign up for their mailing list. They are much easier to engage with than Synchronicity Earth if you're interested in some of the stuff that I'm talking about. And in terms of overlooked species, I think it's something like 1 in 3 freshwater species are endangered or threatened. So it's incredibly high. That's definitely something to learn more about. But I also wanted to say it's amazing that you used a swallow metaphor there, because they are my absolute favorite animals. They are when we see the first swallow of the year, that's a huge moment for me. I always remember the first swallow of every year, and if I don't see them when I'm expecting to see them, which is usually around my birthday, I worry about them, worry where they are. And now, as we start, like, we're mid-August now, but when we start going into September and every swallow could be the last swallow, it's always something that I'm so aware of. And for me, there are so many things changing about the natural world that concern me and worry me, and the regularity of these species coming back, these species, because their cycles and their migrations are dependent on the climate, on the planet, on healthy ecosystems, of not getting poached through their journey. When you do see them, it's that relief that, there is still hope, that they are still coming back, that they are still out there, because we go through periods where we don't see them, and so it's so marked when they come back. And they're absolutely extraordinary animals. Like, just like one species that you could see, and the first animal that I thought of was them, because I love watching them. They have the most beautiful flight.
Yeah, I'm with you all the way. Yeah. Nina, it's been lovely chatting to you on the podcast. Thanks for finding the time, jumping on. We'll hit pause on our mics in a minute, and we'll open up to people on the call that are listening in. I'm sure they want to ask you some questions too. Before we do that, if people want to find out a bit more about your work, and particularly Synchronicity Earth, where should they go? Where should we send them?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have spent all morning updating our email newsletter. So that has been going out quarterly. It will soon become monthly, and that will have the kind of stories about what is happening on the ground, inspiring things that me and my team are finding. So we'll have sort of news articles and features and podcasts and things in one version of that newsletter, which will go alternately every month out with one that will be focused on our stories with our partners. That'll be interviews with people like Caleb, for example. So signing up for our email newsletter, which you can do on our website, which is synchronicityearth.org. You can also follow us on social media if you're on social media. So as I said, we're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. For those that are using handles, it's at Sync Earth, and that's with the H, so SYNCH Earth. So you can follow us on there if you want to learn more. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and DM me questions directly, if you're looking for conservation career advice, then that's also fine. And I'm also on Instagram and Twitter as professionally, so you can find me as well if you search for Nina Seale.
Right. Okay, great. And we'll provide all links in the show notes, which we always do. Nina, once again, thanks so much for your time. It's been great talking. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also, please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people, and we really enjoy reading them all. As you'll have heard, our podcasts are now recorded in front of a live audience who sit in and listen to the chat, and then after the mics are turned off, they get a chance to talk to the host, to share their thoughts, and also to ask questions. It's a really great format. If you'd like to be in the audience, all you need to do is join the Conservation Careers Academy. Now, in the Conservation Careers Academy, you'll get full access to the world's biggest conservation job board, listing over 15,000 jobs, volunteer and internships across the globe each year. You'll also enjoy access to our amazing CC Pro private members community with regular events, networking and support. Plus, you'll get full access to our growing library of career boosting resources, guides and templates. And best of all, it only costs a few dollars, euros or pounds per month to join the Academy. Now, to find out more, please visit conservation-careers.com/academy, or simply click the join button at the top of our website. See you on the inside.